O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but Thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
Paganism 2.0 is this mixture of the revival of ancient value systems. Again, as we talk about some of the central characteristics and practices of paganism, we can see things like ecstatic forms of spirituality, ritual inebriation, the privileging of magic, various forms of sexual orientation, the expression of transgenderism, temple prostitution, the celebration of prostitution to some degree. We can look at human sacrifice, which I would, in my worldview as an Orthodox Christian, certainly associate with the conversation regarding abortion, regarding depopulation, right? One of the things about the depopulation movement is that we have too many people on this planet, and what's happening is that we are then choking Mother Earth, Gaia herself, which comes to a sort of personification of Earth that's very common in the Western world. It's tied with concepts of the Gaia hypothesis by James Lovelock, which is, and for him, to be fair, was not as explicit that Gaia or the Earth itself was a sort of a conscious personality. He's talking about it more in sort of a regulating energy system. But this has been adopted by contemporary paganism to often talk about Earth as Gaia, Mother Earth, as we'll see in the Apple commercial, Mother Nature. Now, Apple as a company, and again, all my products are Apple. I've sort of bought into the Apple ecosystem, if you will. It's just the easiest for me with my laptop, my desktop, my phone. But the symbol of the apple with a bite taken out of it is indicative of the fall of man, right? The tree of knowledge. And it's sort of a Gnostic turn on it, that the computer, in a way, is a celebration of our pursuit to be godlike through our technology. So it's interesting that the fall, within our understanding from a Christian perspective, is certainly tied with a degeneration into these sort of pagan values and pagan religion and nature religion, all this stuff. Now, I want to be clear, us as Christians, we believe that we as mankind are the stewards of creation. We hold creation in an elevated sense. We believe it's beautiful, it's good. We want it to be prosperous. We want to protect it, but we do not personify it. And this is the difference between a sort of pagan worldview and a Christian worldview, and how we relate to it, is that we do not personify nature, because we, in fact, are the epitome of nature. We are the pinnacle. We are the top because we have the Imago Dei. We're made in the in the image of God, and we can participate in the uncreated energies of God, like logic, like reason, like love, conscious love, deliberate love, loving somebody who doesn't choose to love you. This is different than the animal kingdom. This is different than a mammal, a female caring for her young, which we see in nature. But nature and animals are not participating in mercy and compassion and these higher faculties that we would argue are unique to humans. So the central characteristics, let's get into some of the central characteristics of paganism. One of them is that it emphasizes the worship of Earth, and it usually embodies natural world or the physical universe as a personified understandings of gods and goddesses. And so typically it is explicitly polytheistic. If you look on, and then again, for preparation for today's stream, I was looking at various pagan websites and how they describe their own faith. And one of the things I found on multiple sites is their explicit rejection of monotheism. And, we've discussed people just like in our last stream was on Terence McKenna. And Terence McKenna also bought into this worldview that the male dominator ego was tied with the development of monotheism and the understanding of God as male, or using male pronouns. And we've seen even the Church of England, the Anglican Church, talk about, for, again, social justice, for a lot of the contemporary rhetoric around those things, that God, they're going to start using female pronouns or they, them pronouns to refer to God. This has to do with this pagan presupposition, essentially, that the monotheistic religions are male dominated. And as Terence McKenna would talk about, a sort of ego domination, and that it wants to dominate the world and submit everything to its own will, which is certainly an over dramatization of that, I would argue. But the pagan worldview is characterized by sort of polytheism, which they see as more of an expressive form of spirituality that allows for, like I said, multiple gender expressions. You can look into, if you're not familiar with the cults of Ishtar or Inanna, and it was very common that some of the priestess there would actually be transgender women. So it'd be men who would then either become eunuchs, or maybe they would keep their genitalia, but dress in a way that would present themselves as female. And some of the females would actually then present themselves as males. So it's not uncommon. And I actually have a thing just looking up for today's stream that there's multiple examples of transgenderism within pagan spirituality. Now, there's also explicit examples in which paganism rejects transgenderism, and sometimes even homosexuality. But generally speaking, it was much more accommodating to these things. And I would argue, when we get into this section on the philosophical breakdown on paganism, that it's because paganism is inherently relativistic. Now, you could point to things like Plato, and of course, Socrates and Plato were actually critical of the polytheistic religion of the Greeks at their time. This is part why Socrates had to drink the henbane, right? That's why he had to die in the court, because he was converting the youth, or again giving a sort of critical presentation of the Greek gods. So Socrates and Plato. Now, Plato, is he Christian? Is he a monotheist? Maybe you could kind of understand his understanding of the ultimate good as a sort of monotheism. But the way he's not relativistic, like typical forms of paganism, is that he roots objectivity in the ideal forms, which is something that most monotheisms are going to do. And they're going to have a philosophically a more coherent worldview than that of these pagan traditions, which are typically locally oriented. And then it's rooting gods and goddesses as personifications of natural events, nature itself. So how can you say that Odin is better than Zeus? Well, you can't. What happens is the tribes go to war, and whoever wins, therefore, gives credit to their pagan gods, that those pagan gods then are superior. So some of the central characteristics of paganism is, one, that it worships the earth and it personifies natural phenomenon as gods and goddesses. There is no official universal doctrine, and this is part of the relativism of it, is that paganism itself, and I mean it not in regards to, yes, I understand the Roman understanding is like rural people not participating in the Christian religions, but now in the contemporary period, scholars refer to nature worship as paganism. So that's what I'm referring to here, obviously. And paganism, like I said, has no official doctrine across all its traditions. It has a few central characteristics that define it. And those are like the rejection, almost a universal rejection of monotheism. Now, there are a few historical examples in which pagan traditions would identify as like a supreme deity within a pantheon of various deities. But generally speaking, even according to contemporary pagans, they would say one of their central characteristics is the rejection of monotheism. And specifically, they highlight first Christianity and then Judaism and Islam. So the Abrahamic traditions. Also, contemporary paganism places a great emphasis on ecological issues as central to their spirituality in their relationship to the ultimate, which would be a sort of this pantheon of various deities. So when we look at the global climate change, I have an article which I think is fair to say is that we're witnessing the growth of a new religion, that global climate change, even the transgender, the LGBTQ movement, in a way, this is a sort of new religion because it has to do with the ultimate concern, the ultimate authority for various groups and peoples. So this, again, is another central characteristic, is that for contemporary pagans, and I mean, basically, there was a pagan revival in the 1960s with the counterculture, along with the sort of growth and popularization of Eastern mysticism. This was due to so many various Asian ethnicities and groups of people coming to the Western world, able to talk about their dharmic religions, Taoism, various forms of Buddhism, this types of thing. So the 60s is one of, we see then the growth of Druidism, Wicca, all these various forms of paganism, of which I said these ecological concerns play a central importance for them. And when we look at this Apple commercial, I'd say, again, this is part and parcel of the exact same thing. So, another characteristic is that the majority of pagan traditions believed in a form of reincarnation. And there is a book that I actually read on contemporary Catholics in America. And one of the surprising things that I saw, it was like between 40 and 50% of Catholics, this was a survey done, they themselves believed in reincarnation. And so reincarnation as an understanding of how we um, uh, what happens after we die, well, it's a growing belief system, and this is another general characteristic of paganism. Again, you'll be able to find examples in which that's not the case, but many believe that you would reincarnate. Even Pythagoras believed in a sort of transmigration of the soul. But many pagans would see that depending on how you live your life, how in favor you are of the various gods, that you could reincarnate as an animal, you could reincarnate as a tree, or you can reincarnate as another person with another opportunity of some sort. Now, it's a little bit different than Hinduism and the Dharmic religions, but certainly that reincarnation dimension is present. Practices in paganism may include, like I said, ritual inebriation. Typically, paganism does not understand inebriation as any sort of sinful thing. Now, this is another thing in which they would highlight as a detriment to the monotheisms, because Judaism, Islam, and Christianity would view inebriation as some type of sin, to put it that way, within a Christian context. Now, of course, I understand that there's mystical traditions such as Kabbalah, which would engage in ritual inebriation, Sufis regarding hashish and cannabis ingestion. But generally speaking, the orthodox of these faiths would not promote ritual inebriation. And this is something that we can see pretty consistent among historical examples of paganism. Also, we see the relationship to sex. So group sex, polyamory, having multiple sexual partners, polygamy, having multiple wives in a sort of pagan ritual of marriage, fairly common. Also, potential examples of ritualistic orgiastic activity. So, as I said, we still know of examples of civilizations in the Amazon, for example, but many have theorized some of the pagan groups of the ancient Middle East and Mediterranean, that they would engage in sort of full moon orgies. And this is, as I highlighted in my last stream, that some of the psychedelic community or the New Age community, but Terence McKenna would celebrate, as that it would sort of obfuscate male paternity. Because again, you can highlight that monotheism, that you can highlight that male, or as we call the phallogocentrism of Christianity, wanting to understand and know male paternity. This is the whole lineage of Abraham, right? This is the promise of God to Abraham. So, ritualistic sex, and I mean that we see in pagan traditions like temple prostitutes. I did a whole stream discussing the history of temple prostitutes, which include often men who present themselves as women and women who present themselves as men that would engage in these sort of sexual rituals. Also, human sacrifice, not uncommon at all. Multiple scholars have looked into human sacrifice, and of course, almost all their examples exist within a pagan context. The Druids being a very explicit example in which they were very open, but you can look at, for example, the Aztecs, a group that they would perform their sacrifices to their gods, in which they would offer people of their own community, but often people that were captured or rival tribes, to their gods for blessings. This human sacrifice, is, I would say, still present in this contemporary Pagan 2.0 with abortion, with the sterility movement. I mean, we see that the fear of death due to the coup in 2020 certainly prompted a lot of people to get the jab, which has caused a lot of people to unfortunately experience a lot of ill health effects. Many people have been passed away through it, we'll say, just to be politically correct here, and not to be too conspiratorial, as they say, right? So human sacrifice, cannibalism. I have a whole thing here on some of the contemporary, like Richard Dawkins, a noteworthy atheist, famous for his arguing against Christians, talking about how, um, we should actually eat human lab-grown meat. Some people think I'm making this up. I'm not. I'll actually show you this article right here. So here it is. So again, why would you eat human meat grown in a lab? Controversial scientist Richard Dawkins suggests it could eradicate the taboo against cannibalism. And of course, they cite that we need to stop eating meat as to save the planet, right? So veganism is something that emerges quite often in regards to this paganism 2.0, that we need to save the planet. How? Well, we do so by stop eating meat. We can become vegans. We can become vegetarians, or as even Richard Dawkins is highlighting, if you want to eat meat, you can just eat your own human lab-grown meat. Well, again, maybe he doesn't think of it this way, but I would certainly see it as an Orthodox Christian that this is a degeneration back to a sort of pagan worldview in which cannibalism was acceptable. Multiple groups. Again, you can look at Papua New Guinea, you can look at the Maori tribes in New Zealand, where ritual cannibalism wasn't unheard of. Even within the ancient Middle East, it wasn't unheard of like the Scythians and various tribes, nomadic peoples, that when they dominated a certain group in battle, that they would eat the flesh of the person to demonstrate their dominance and whatever positive characteristics that person or that enemy had. Well, that the victorious tribe would now be able to acquire those virtues. Another general characteristic is that they have no concept of sin and virtuous suffering. So pagan religion, generally speaking, is not going to be so adamant about this objective moral framework and how we align ourselves with God. And this is why, again, there is no universal doctrine in paganism, because there is no emphasis on any objective moral understanding. The way you align with your deities is through sacrifice. Now, it could be animal sacrifice, but as I said, human sacrifice quite often. In the Bible, we can see Baal, for example, and Moloch, and how the Jews continue to fall victim to sacrificing their firstborn for these blessings from these pagan gods. And I think people now are sacrificing themselves in various ways that I think are totally consistent with the ancient practices, but what I would call paganism 2.0. Now, paganism 2.0 is undoing, I would argue, the remnants of Christianity left in Western civilization. This is why it seems like it's a new thing, or that it's a novel thing, or that it's a beneficial aspect to our society, because even though, as we'll get into the philosophical dimension, paganism is generally relativistic when it comes to morals and ethics and epistemology. Well, they use the rhetoric of objectivity and objective morals to talk about social justice and climate change and why you need to, own nothing and love it, as according to the World Economic Forum, that you will own nothing and you will be happy, you will love it. Well, they use this sort of rhetoric of objectivity to promote their worldview, and I would say the bringing forth of general the mass acceptance of homosexuality, of transgenderism, of the idea of radical forms of feminism, that people aren't having children anymore, that people aren't getting married anymore. In a way, this is a paganism 2.0. This is a paganism that is novel and new, but is, again, undoing the remnants left of Christianity in our culture. And that paganism 2.0, again, is all about saving Gaia, saving Mother Earth. And it's in this attempt to save Mother Earth, it says that it needs to depopulate. And this is almost consistent among anybody who believes this stuff. And that's why you should be sterile. That's probably why you shouldn't have children. There's a whole anti-natalist movement talking about why you shouldn't have children, and that if you do have children, well, that means that you're basically bad for the planet. You're too obsessed with your own desires, and you don't care about people. You're not virtuous. You're not virtuous. Now, from a Christian worldview, that's what we're called to. We're called to marriage. We're called to sacrifice our will to unite with somebody else, and we're called to be fruitful. And anybody who's ever been born on this planet was given the right to be born by God, not by anybody else. So, or not by, not like this is some accident waiting to happen. This is how it's kind of presented today. I believe that if there's 8 billion people here, God clearly wants all those people to be here. And many scientists have argued that, hey, we have plenty of resources that we can feed everybody. But this is part of, again, the rhetoric of this paganism 2.0. And so pagan values are spread now through the modern technology. And this gets into a central dimension of my premise today, is the global village. Marshall McLuhan's understanding of what digital technology were going to do to our society, and that it was going to revert us back to a primitive state. If I bring this back up, we can see it. Oh, we can see it here. Let's see. Oh, there we go. That the global village, Marshall McLuhan, who was a Canadian thinker, coined the term global village in the 1960s. It indicates the daily production and consumption of media, images, and content by global audiences. McLuhan views the retribalization of Western society are prefigured in American anthropologist Edward Sapir's 1933 article, Communication, in which he wrote, the multiplication of far-reaching techniques of communication has two important results. In the first place, it increases the sheer radius of communication, so that for certain purposes, the whole civilized world is made a psychological equivalent of a primitive tribe. And that's where you get into McLuhan's work, which I have a video we're going to watch real quick, where he talks about the world as a global village. But he's highlighting how he believed that the digital technologies were going to revert us back to a pagan worldview. Now, McLuhan was famous for trying to not put value judgments into his work, but he was a faithful Catholic who converted as an adult in the beginning of his academic career. And so privately, he was very concerned about this. Privately, he was much more in favor of a literate society. And he even tied the Bible and the people of the books, which include the Abrahamic faiths, that this was something that he believed was more beneficial for society. And it involves a more formalism, right? So we can see this now in the way people dress. You go to the store and people are in their pajama pants and flip-flops, and they look like they just crawled out of bed. Their hair's messed up. There is no formalism. Look at the way we talk to people. Look at the way we dress. Formalism has totally been lost in our society. And I would argue at least, that it has to do with, again, this pagan effect through the technology, altering our sensory ratios, making us more and more like pre-literate people. So philosophically, when we look at paganism, like I said, Socrates, somebody that viewed themselves as incredibly rational, saw the idea of the personification of natural events as gods and goddesses as irrational. And I would argue that that is the case. It is irrational. And so the inherently relativistic nature of paganism is something that would be contrary, again, to a monotheistic worldview or explicitly a Christian worldview, which we do have an objective basis for epistemology. We do have an explicit understanding of our metaphysics. We do have an objective understanding of morality. And yes, it has to do with revelation, but then it has to do with philosophical categories and being able to philosophically justify these things. I posted a reel recently on Sam Harris, and it was amazing how upset so many atheists got. And literally, we're trying to argue for relativism and stating it as if it's an objective fact. I mean, this is the breakdown in the mind. This is why so many people think that a man can become a woman. How can you tell me I'm wrong by yelling at the Christians of the audience that, oh my God, don't you understand? Morals are culturally constructed. There is no such thing as objective truth. Well, if that's true, then you aren't right. And the inability to see this, I think, is a breakdown, one, in our education system, which is quite obvious at this point. But people just don't have the sophistication to look and appreciate the things that we were given. And so we can feel something moving, changing dramatically in our culture. And I would say it's the loss of so many things that we have taken for granted, like the objective morale and the objective ethics that we hold ourselves to. And so you see all these videos on social media, TikTok, Instagram, where these people are like, oh my gosh, I don't feel safe in San Francisco anymore. This guy came up to me and hit me. She had blood on her face and he stole my purse. Okay, but you voted for this. You believed in the worldview that allowed for these things. You condoned them. You disagreed with the people who promoted a worldview in which we needed to limit these things and promote a more traditional understanding of morals and ethics so that we can have a civilized world. Again, a primitive tribe is pre-civilized. And I would think that anybody watching civilization right now in the West, we're seeing it become more and more uncivilized. I don't think that's a crazy thing to say at this point. So at least Platonism at least grounds objectivity in the universal ideals. And this is something that I at least gave credit to with Terence McKenna, even though he identified himself as basically a shamanistic, relativistic worldview. However, he also identified as a Platonist. And because he identified as a Platonist, he was able to have some sort of objectivity in his worldview, although I would say it wasn't totally consistent, because he also argued for the transgression of these male dominator ego cultures or Christian morality and ethics. But paganism grounds God in the materialistic world. Again, it's inherently relativistic. It's an inherently local spirituality. But you can look at Platonism and then Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism, I think, is probably the epitome, the pinnacle of paganism, if you will, although Neoplatonism isn't polytheistic. It's explicitly a sort of monotheism. And Neoplatonism is a very erudite spirituality, although it's embedded within a sort of magical worldview of theurgy and performing various rituals to access God and move closer to the ultimate one, the monad. But the way that paganism is emerging in the 21st century, Paganism 2.0, you're seeing it, one, with the radical left, which is about the sort of hedonistic trends of ancient paganism, but we're also seeing it in the radical right. I mean, the white supremacist movement, these types of people who identify, that are they're racial essentialists in the sense that that's the only thing that's important. They worship Odin. They do the Roman salute. And yet it fundamentally, at a philosophical level, it breaks down. It's not able to justify universal categories, universal understandings, objective epistemology, objective morals, and ethics. And so it uses this ethical rhetoric to talk about social justice and climate change and why you ought to do something. But I would argue Paganism 2.0 is partly and parcel why it was a growth in the 1960s moving forward is to the postmodern turn in epistemology. The postmodern turn in philosophy rejects universal claims. It rejects what they call universal narratives, universal themes, universal categories, all for your own personal experience. You yourself have the truth. You have your own truth. That's what they claim. And so the postmodern breakdown in epistemology allows for the return of this pagan relativism in which everybody is led as the ancient paganism is about, rather than a understanding of sin and suffering. It's about the pursuit of pleasure, joy, and a celebration of life. Now, as Christians, we also celebrate life, but we understand, due to our understanding and our theology of the fall, that there is a inherent suffering. And if anybody went to church today at an Orthodox parish, if you're on the Western calendar, as I am, the gospel reading was Christ telling people to carry your cross, carry your own cross. The idea that we actually move closer to God through our suffering in this world. This is not anything that would be indicative of a pagan worldview, because the idea is to avoid the suffering and pursue the pleasure, the joy, and the celebration of life. You can look at the Bacchanalian type festivals and the Dionysian festivals. These are, in a way, even though people want to claim Dionysius or Christ was a type of Dionysius, no, there's, again, explicit inversions there. And one of the ideas is that we would get ritually inebriated or pursue ecstasy. And that's my point, is paganism is about the pursuit of ecstasy. And so you look at Paganism 2.0 in our culture and drug culture and the acceptance of drugs in multiple ways. Well, this is, again, part and parcel of these ancient practices. And so McLuhan and his global village, I think, is really, really insightful, because it's through companies like Microsoft and Apple where these pagan values are being spread and the global village is coming into fruition. And we can see this. I talked about before that when I went to Germany and Greece this past summer, that one of the things that I noticed explicitly was that the Gen Zers, that they all have the same culture. That my nieces are Gen Zers. That my nieces, the oldest, are fraternal twins, and they're seniors in high school right now. And I'm very familiar with what they're into, the fashions, the trends, the things that they get. So the shoes, the jeans, the all the fashion that they're participating in. When I went to Germany, that's exactly what I saw with the Gen Z. When I went to Greece, that's exactly what I saw with the Gen Z. They're participating in a new global culture through the social media. And I think this is indicative with McLuhan's theories of the global village. And it reverts people back, as he argued, to a primitive tribal worldview, a tribal orientation of our sensory ratios, in which things are going to become, again, more archaic. And we can see, look at the acceptance. Look at how Gen Z, 21%, I believe, in the United States identify as LGBTQ, whereas just the millennials, it was like 2 to 5%. Dramatic increase. Dramatic increase. So the digital technologies are changing our senses, they're changing our desires, and they're changing our values. And that's why when we watch this commercial from Apple, it totally makes sense to me. I don't think this is a mystery at all. And it makes the companies like Apple the leaders in the alteration of our value system and the movement towards this paganism 2.0.